Okay, and I'm seeing that everyone has muted themselves. Well done. So, and you can unmute yourself when it comes to the questions. Tom, very warm welcome to our monthly meeting. It's very kind of you to step in at what was essentially not quite last minute, but it was certainly, you saved the day by saying, yeah, okay, I'll do it for you. You've been chair of CND now for 2 years, is it since 2020-ish or so? Yeah. And then if you have a look on Google, then you'll see that there's quite a few publications and books that Tom has to his name as well. So you can possibly ask him questions about quite a number of other topics. But of course, tonight, the main topic of conversation is the Doomsday Clock. Tom, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we had a small child fall down the stairs, which is why it's like this every evening. It's fairly chaotic, so let's hope that there's not too much screaming and shouting over the next few minutes. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. And it's always a pleasure to come to meetings like this because I'm not a huge believer in common sense. I mean, I like the idea, but I'd suggest that most of us gathered here today do not really share in common sense. But what unites us is that we have good sense as opposed to common sense. And that good sense has at its center, the understanding that we need to work for peace. We need to work to remove the conditions that create wars. And we need to work to prevent climate change, and we need to work to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So it's good for a change to be in the company of quite a lot of good sense and a lot of experience in terms of campaigning and working on these issues over a long period of time. So thank you for inviting me. So we are at 90 seconds to midnight, and it's worth pausing on that, as I'm sure we all have, and to reflect that since 1947, when the atomic scientists first set the hands of their doomsday clock, we have never been as close to midnight as we are at the moment. So let's be clear about what that means. Midnight represents existential threat. It represents megadeath. It represents the whole of humanity in peril. And the people who set this clock are not, out there raving ideologues or political characters or what have you. These people are scientists, whether they're nuclear scientists or climate scientists or geologists or whatever, and they look at the totality of the risks that present themselves to humanity, and they make a determination of where we're at and of the risks that present themselves to us. So we're 90 seconds from midnight, closer than we have ever been. And if that's not a sobering moment for us all, then I'm not sure what is. But we should be encouraged, and indeed the atomic scientists and everybody else who pays attention to them encourages us to think about how we got to this point and what we might do about it. And for me, they're important questions and they're interconnected. So how did we get to this point? Well, last year we were at 2 minutes to midnight, 120 seconds. And last year we were closer than we have ever been to mass existential threats, to megadeath, to perils, to humanity. And the last time we were at that point, I think, was in 1953, was it? Which was the year following the US testing its first hydrogen bomb. So this is a long and a winding story. Throughout the ages, from 1961 to 1962, and the sharp threats that were presented through international relations in the depths of the Cold War, to the 1980s, when Pershing missiles were deployed across Europe and nuclear tensions were at their sharpest. We have never been as close. We have never been as close to these existential threats and these existential risks as we have been now. And everybody knows it. Not just us, not just the peace movements, not just the anti-war movements, not just those of us who pay attention to international affairs, but also our rulers, our governments, and their military alliances. They all know it, which is why in January last year, the Permanent Five, that is the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, who also happen to be the 5 main states which possess nuclear weapons, released a joint statement echoing similar statements from the 1980s. And the statement was headlined as follows, and you all know the words: a nuclear war can never be won, and therefore a nuclear war must never be fought. So this is January 2022. They all said it. They all signed up to it. If you ask them, and if I think about the British government in particular, if you ask them, they will claim that they are committed to reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons. They're committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They all recognise, or so they say, they all recognise the need to prevent the risk of nuclear war and nuclear confrontation. They all think, if asked, they'll tell you this, they all think that nuclear tensions should be reduced. But we have to honestly ask, and we have to honestly question whether or not they're sincere about all of this, whether or not they truly mean it, whether or not they give a damn about the existential risks that face us all. And if you think about the drivers of the changes in the in the doomsday clock, if you think about the factors that the atomic scientists take into account, they range from threats of pandemic to threats of war to nuclear threats to climate change. And it's climate change that I think is illustrative. I mean, just prior to me starting to speak, we had somebody talking about the upcoming XR action. And there's a mirroring there, isn't there? Now, every politician, every government spokesperson will tell you that they recognise that climate change is a reality, that they recognise the risks presented by impending climate catastrophe, even if they don't use that word, that's what's actually going on. They will champion and talk about measures, small measures, to ameliorate this, that, or the other aspect of climate change. And yet, they want to exploit, I think that's the technical term, they want to exploit or get at the last remaining oil and gas reserves in the North Sea, the biggest untapped source of fossil fuels, I think, currently known. They have started up, certainly close to where I live, a coal-fired power plant that was due for mothballing is now back in action. Measures to stop general pollution, whether it's sewage being pumped into our rivers or our seas or whatever else, have been drastically undermined. So on the one hand, there's this recognition of the threat and the risks, but in terms of policy and what actually happens on a day-to-day basis, they continue to drive and they continue to exacerbate all of the factors that are driving us towards climate catastrophe. And I'm afraid that the same is true when it comes to risks of war. and in particular when it comes to risks of nuclear use. Remember, they all have told us that a nuclear war can never be won, and therefore it must never be fought. But look at what has happened. Look at what has happened. Whether it was President Bush Jr.'s scrapping of the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2003, which started a conveyor belt which led to Trump's undermining of the INF treaty, the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the JCPOA or the Iran deal, the Open Skies treaty, up to Putin's subsequent suspension of the New START treaty. We've seen a consistent undermining and a consistent chipping away at all of the measures, all of the treaties and procedures which were in place to prevent the proliferation or the development of new nuclear weapons. Our government will tell us, and other governments will tell us likewise, that they're firmly committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yet in the integrated review under the Johnson government, we saw a scrapping of the cap on the number of nuclear warheads and an increase in that cap. So Britain is developing new nuclear warheads and increasing the stockpile in contravention to the NPT. We've seen things like the AUKUS agreement, which tread all over the nuclear non-proliferation treaty in terms of proliferating nuclear technology for military purposes to Australia. We've seen the British government announce that it will no longer be as opaque or as transparent as it has been in the past about its nuclear posture and its nuclear policies. So a consistent chipping away at all of the treaties, all of the controls, all of the deals which were put in place to try and create some form of nuclear security. And now we have a situation in Ukraine, which has its own dynamic and a number of factors driving it and feeding into it. But we now have a situation in Ukraine where President Putin has launched a war. It's a war of aggression. Undoubtedly, it breaches the UN Charter. Undoubtedly, it's illegal. Undoubtedly, it's bloody. Undoubtedly, like all wars have ever been, but particularly so in the modern, highly mechanized and technological age, particularly murderous. But we have a situation where in that context, President Putin has issued a number of sometimes thinly veiled, sometimes tangential nuclear threats. But let's be clear, the nuclear taboo has been shattered. The prohibition or the self-imposed prohibition on directly making nuclear threats has gone out the window. And let's be clear that this is not the only or the first instance of a world leader or a leader of a nuclear armed state making such threats. But it's the only, Chirac did it when asked. Jeff Hoon did it during the 2003 invasion of Iraq when asked, would Britain use nuclear weapons if Iraq used its non-existent weapon, so-called weapons of mass destruction? He said, yes, we would. So there's a long trail here. But this is the first instance we have in terms of Ukraine where the leader of a nuclear armed state in what is arguably a war, not just between Russia and Ukraine, but extending more widely, where nuclear threats have been made, and where we have the United States government openly admitting that it's made reciprocal threats of nuclear use. So Jake Sullivan, who is a spokesperson for Antony Blinken, who is the US Secretary of State, confirmed in an interview with the New York Times late last year that contrary to prior denials that the United States had made nuclear threats to Russia. In fact, they had made them, but it was all right because they'd made them in private and directly towards Russia. So we have the two largest, bear in mind, the two largest nuclear armed states on the surface of planet Earth trading nuclear threats. We have open warfare in Ukraine. We have people being savaged and murdered on a regular basis in that country. We have death and destruction. We have mass displacement. Millions have left the country. Millions have been internally displaced. But we have overall, an incredibly dangerous situation, which is the primary driver over the last year from the hands of the atomic clock moving from 2 minutes to midnight to 90 seconds to midnight. This is dangerous territory, and this is dangerous stuff. But I'm keen that just like we put the context of the dialing of the atomic clock from 2 minutes to 90 seconds in a historical context, and we look at what's happened from 1947 up until this point, as well as calling out the hypocrisy of the leaders of nuclear armed states in terms of their verbal commitments and the reality of what that means on the ground. We need to understand the reality of what has happened in Ukraine, and not just what has happened over the past year, but what has happened prior to that, as well as what and how that might inform what happens from this point onwards. Because we need to, we all know here, I am certain, that Ukraine has been a long-term running sore. The situation hasn't just developed over the last 12 months. It didn't just happen or spark off in 2014 with events at that point, but it's been an ongoing and long-running situation from the early 2000s, if not the late 1990s, up until now. It has been viewed on a long-term basis as a very important chess piece or pawn in the geopolitical global game, and there has to be an accounting for that, and that has to be factored into our understanding of what's going on. All of us here will also know that, contrary to repeated assurances and repeated commitments that NATO would not expand, that NATO would not absorb and envelop further states to the east, we all know that that happened. And we all know that that happened despite the promises, yes, but also despite explicit warnings and explicit warnings against that from all corners, from the leadership of the CIA to the anti-war movement and peace movements, from people like Henry Kissinger to people like, not Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski and his grand chessboard, to people like Frank Blackerby, who was the director of SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Studies and Information. They all warned consistently that expanding NATO in this way would only build tensions and would only create a situation where things could get out of hand and where things could get very dangerous indeed. So there's a problem with NATO. And to illustrate that point, I mean, it's not the only problem, and the situation in Ukraine is very complex. There are all sorts of things feeding in. But from our point of view, as peace activists based in the United Kingdom, and as people who would hope to affect British foreign policy and British military policy, it's something we have to register. And we only need to look at the fact that NATO's nuclear bootprint is expanding across Europe as we speak to register just how dangerous and just how precarious things are. So what do I mean by the expanding nuclear bootprint? Well, many of us will know that US nuclear weapons under NATO auspices have historically been stored in Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, at 2 bases, and in Turkey. There are 150 or so US nuclear bombs, or have been historically based across Europe. Up until the late 2000s, they were based at the Lakenheath Air Base in Great Britain, up until the point that they were removed. The United States has put billions, hundreds of billions, into developing a new class of fighter bomber aircraft, the F-35Es, which have enhanced capability. These are hypersonic planes, and they're also nuclear planes, nuclear capable planes. They're capable of carrying a new generation of US nuclear bomb called the B-61-12s. These are not just freefall bombs. You know, these are not just bombs that will be dropped from an aeroplane over a target below. These have something called a steerable capability. They are longer range. So the steerable capability in the longer range means that they can be dropped at a distance from their target, a bit like a missile. Okay, so they're not just free fall, they're steerable and they're longer range. And they also have something called a dialable capability. And the dialability means that the threshold, or the amount of power in the nuclear explosion they produce, is variable, which means that in US nuclear strategy, they are considered or bracketed in a class which comes under the label usable nuclear weapons. Usable. So in US military strategy and NATO military strategy, there is the idea that you can use a nuclear weapon in the battlefield. Now, deploying such weapons in Europe and expanding the blueprint by deploying them again in Britain would be a criminal and disgusting act at any point, But in the context of the heightened nuclear tensions we face now, of a war in Ukraine and everything that means, to be going ahead with this deployment of these warplanes and these bombs now, I think, or I would argue, tells you everything you need to know about the character of NATO, the character of US military policy, and the character of the relationship between Great Britain and the United States in terms of the military aspect of that. So we're in a very dangerous situation. How much longer do I have to go on for? I can't hear you. If you.
Sorry, I was muted. Tom, normally we say to the speakers that 20 minutes might be fine. So if you have another 5 or 10 minutes, oh no, don't worry at all. No, it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, it's horrible stuff, but please keep going.
I'm trying to set a context of how complex this thing is and how dangerous this thing is. But I want to go back to, so hopefully I've painted a picture of quite how dangerous this thing is, but I want to paint a picture about the time thing, because I've been thinking quite a lot about the time and what that represents over the past few weeks. So we're told and we know that we're closer to existential risk and we're closer to the possibility of use of nuclear weapons than we have been at any time in the past. And a lot is made about this idea of midnight. What does it mean when midnight arrives? What does that represent? We know it represents megadeath, mass death, existential risks, so on and so forth. But if we're to understand how we can dial back or pull back the hands of this atomic clock, if we're to understand how we can reduce the risk that's presented to us all, then I think it's quite useful and very instructive to look at examples where midnight has already arrived, to look at situations around the world which are so sharply posed and so disastrous that they already make the headline news. And perhaps, you know, one of the most instructive examples of this in the recent past was the recent earthquake in Turkey. Now, an earthquake, as we all know, is a natural phenomenon. They happen as a result of the sudden release of built-up elastic tension between plates, tectonic plates. They're unpredictable. We can explain them. We know why they happen and we know their effects, but they're unpredictable. And when those massive earthquakes, because there was more than one, arrived on the people of Turkey a couple of weeks ago, midnight arrived for all too many of them. Midnight arrived. The last time I looked, which was last week, the death toll was 40,000. More than 300,000 buildings had been destroyed. Buildings collapsed above, around and below these people, children sleeping in their beds. Tens of thousands, men, women, children were killed. And 1 million people are now living in tents. 1 million people are now living in tents. Midnight truly arrived in this discrete geographical area. And people were angry in Turkey, and the people are angry. They're angry at the deaths, they're angry at the destruction, understandably, but they're angry with the government. They're angry with the government. Why? Because this region is not immune from earthquakes. They've happened before. Large earthquakes have happened there previously. And when they happened the last time, a lot of people died, and a lot of buildings collapsed, and a lot of people were put into tents and to camps. And at that time, the government legislated, as quite reasonably, to improve building standards, to reinforce the buildings that were there, to put in place emergency response protocols, to ensure that anybody made homeless by dint of an earthquake would be rapidly rehomed. Measures and laws and rules were passed to try and minimize the death and destruction as a result of earthquakes. But none of this happened. The words were spoken, just like we've heard that a nuclear war can never be won and therefore should never take place. We hear the words, they tell us that, but nothing is done. Nothing has been done to avert a nuclear war. Quite the contrary, lots has been done to increase the likelihood of a nuclear war. The same story when midnight arrived in Turkey. All those promises, all that recognition that things should be done to prevent destruction and death, nothing. Instead, corruption took hold. Buildings were thrown up with no enhanced safety standards. None of the existing buildings were reinforced. None of the emergency planning was put in place. And therefore, the next time there was an earthquake, 40,000 people died, men, women, and children. 300,000 buildings collapsed, and 1 million people are in tents. Now, this is a result of human choices. Nobody could have stopped the earthquake. But collectively, as individuals and as governments, measures could have been put in place to prevent that level of death and destruction. A nuclear war is not a natural phenomenon. It is not unpredictable. It is not something that arrives by magic or by surprise or through the laws of geophysical physics or whatever. It's the consequence of a series of terrible and reckless and overwhelmingly bad human choices. So in the same way that the very worst could have been avoided in Turkey, the very worst can be avoided on a planetary scale, whether it's nuclear war or whether it's climate change. And I think if we're to begin to talk about dialing back the hands of the doomsday clock, that's what we need to recognise. And we also need to recognise that those of us assembled here who don't have common sense, but who have good sense with respect to all of these problems, have a role to play in all of that. I could go on for much longer, but I'll shut up now because I've gone on for too long, and we can have a chat about it. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to change the view slightly so that everyone can see everyone else here. You can do your own thing also with the view button top right, and you can control what you're actually looking at. Tom, yeah, I did think we were at Penny Wixie's funeral a few days ago, and one of our founder members of the peace movement, she hasn't been coming to meetings quite so regularly, the speaker meetings, whether they're on Zoom or whether they're physical. And her reason was, she said, because when I come, I go away feeling really depressed. So she's decided for her own defense to now kind of ration the number of meetings that she attends. Maybe, is there something that you may want to just add to your presentation? Then her name is Hazel. She's not at the meeting this evening, I don't think. I'm not seeing her. But is there something you can add? You mentioned a little bit about the dialing back, but mostly it's this business of that we, as the peace movement, perhaps, are failing in our attempts to actually get the government to dial back.
I don't think we can accuse ourselves of failing, right? Because we do what we can do, and we're right. You know, we're right objectively, intellectually, in any way you want to look at it. We're right, and that's that is not a failure. The failure is in the political structures and the political, domain in which we work in. But the most, things are very difficult. I'm not going to, I can't dress it up any other way. The situation is difficult and the situation is perilous. In matters of peace, in matters of climate change, in matters of civil liberties, in matters of democracy, things are very difficult. But our hope, our singular hope, is that the bad situation is the result of human actions, and the remedy is also in the hands of collective mass human action. And I think we should always bear that in mind. Everybody, the drivers for this are human, and the solution is human, and it's human society and human association that can remedy it. I mean, we've all experienced mass demonstrations. We've all experienced political instances of political progress as well as political regress. But that's our abiding hope. There's no magical switch or magical solution apart from having more discussions like this, spreading the message and spreading the ideas. There are particular things that CND is doing that I think everybody should be involved with, but I was going to come back to those sort of at the end. But I think, I can understand why what I've said is despairing, but it's also the case that we have, the potential and the power to change all of this as well. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's humans who are making this happen, and it will be humans who will change the direction of things.
Thanks. It's an open floor now to anyone who would like to ask questions. Just either physically raise your hand so that I can see you, or use the hand raising functionality on Zoom, whichever you prefer. Oh, Susie, sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead, take yourself off mute.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Tom what he thinks we can do more to stop this escalation in the war, because it started off with the government going, we're going to send protective equipment, and then it's gradually ratcheted up over the year to being, oh, we'll send some launchers, and then it's going to be tanks, and now it's going to be aircraft, and I suppose the next thing they want to send is like nuclear weapons. So what worries me is that all the political parties seem to be agreeing with this approach, and the media all seem to be agreeing with it, apart from a few smaller newspapers and independent ones. And the way I see it, like not even covering the Stop the War march, right? Because the whole country seems to be on, oh, this is all right, this ratcheting up of the war. And if you speak up against it, you're seen as some kind of pariah or crazy or something. And I'm just wondering what Tom thinks we can do to like oppose it more, as well as maybe just, you know, marches and things like that, and how to get more of the opposing viewpoints across, and how we can influence some of the political parties to take a stand against it, because we've even got like the Labour Party accepting that they're going to do more Trident and things like that, and I've always been against that. So I'm just wondering what we could be doing. Thanks, Tom.
Tom, I think.
Do you want me to come back on that, or take Peter as well?
Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. I sort of I agree with what you've said, Tom, and I do think one of the keys is just to try and do everything we can to spread the message of the reality we all face, because I really don't think people who aren't as close to it as you and many of us involved here, I don't think people realize just the situation our political leaders are taking us into, quite blindly walking into World War III. But I wanted to share with you something I came across last night, which rather surprised me, and I thought I think it might be of interest to you. I was reading this book, King Solomon's Ring. I don't know if you've read this, but it's about animal behavior. And it's very interesting about how animals sort of defuse fights between themselves and submit and actually end up not killing each other. And I got to the end of the book, and the last paragraph I thought I'd just share with you, and this was written in 1935. This is a guy that really looked at how animals confronted each other. And he said, I concluded in an article called Morals and Weapons of Animals, which appeared in a Viennese journal, with the words, "The day will come when two warring factions will be faced with the possibility of each wiping the other out completely. The day may come when the whole of mankind is divided into two such opposing camps. Shall we then behave like doves, who actually do fight to the death, or like wolves, who have a rather sophisticated submission system? The fate of mankind will be settled by the answer to this question. We may well be apprehensive." I thought, this is pretty extraordinary. It's really saying that actually what's happened is that man has developed these weapons and the power to wipe each other out in a timescale that's quite different from normal evolutionary processes. And we haven't actually evolved far enough to control this madness. And it just struck me as a very interesting perspective on this, because at one level one's thinking, how is it we never seem to learn that war is a terrible thing, and it doesn't, you know, always has to end in discussion and compromise? How do we still believe war is a way to solve our problems? And this book just sort of brought me up short and thought, oh my goodness, you know, we really are the really are the cause of our own problems. And but I do think, on a more positive note, we do need to just spread the word in any way we can, so that people realize just how close we are to disaster. Thanks.
Thanks. Is it all right to come in now?
Please, Tom, go.
Thank you for that, Peter. I was going to mention, but I resisted the temptation, but you've provoked me now, Peter. The people may have seen news reports and coverage of the surveillance that's been undertaken in domestic gardens of people who leave food out for animals. Now, if any of you, I bet, like me, a number of you here have been or are currently cat owners. And we're generally under the impression that cats are the biggest beasts in the urban jungle and have everything the way that they want it, and are the main predator. But if you look at some of the footage from these experiments, I'm at risk of going off topic here, but I promise it will return. If you look at the footage of these experiments, you will see not just foxes fighting off cats, But actually, the conclusion is that the badger, the friendly badger, this endangered species, this precarious community of badgers, are actually top of the chain and do a very good job of fighting off and standing their ground and getting their way. And in a way, I think that might be a useful analogy for the peace movement, because they think that the peace movement is this rare thing, a bit endangered, a bit precarious. But in fact, if we put our mind to it, I'm not suggesting we fight over food in people's back gardens, but if we collectively put our minds to it, we have quite a lot of power and quite a lot of influence. But it is purely a question, I think, in that respect of getting our act together. And Peter's right in that our first step in that is raising the alarm, because one of the remarkable things, or is it remarkable? That's probably the wrong word. One of the alarming things when it comes to raising the alarm is the lack of memory about what nuclear war might mean, and the lack of appreciation actually of what conventional war means and what it represents. And there does seem to be a blasé attitude, you know, in a different way to I've ever experienced in my 42 years on the planet. And I'm sure those of you who have been around for longer are probably more startled by this lack of appreciation. But there seems to be very little appreciation of what, you know, the consequences of nuclear use would be, and also of how sharply posed the risks are. And I would therefore argue that one of the main jobs of the anti-war, peace and anti-nuclear movements is to raise that alarm and to clearly explain the reality of these risks. And I think that's our first step. In terms of Susan's comments, you know, what can we do? What can we do? Well, the reality is that actually everybody knows, with respect to Ukraine, everybody knows, who's worth their salt, knows that the situation in Ukraine will end in peace talks and will end in negotiations. Everybody knows that. And there has been a shift more recently in that a number of commentators from government and think tanks and more widely are starting to recognize this. But what they will say is that now is not the time. The negotiations and the talks will happen at some point, just not now. They'll happen at some point, not just now. So those of us who are arguing for negotiation, diplomacy and peace talks, actually those in power agree with us. It's a question of when. And part of that when, the solution to that when question is recognizing the urgency of the situation and communicating just how sharply posed everything is. Because it's not, you know, fundamentally, you know, in the day-to-day here and now, it's a question of how many Ukrainians will die, how much of Ukraine will be destroyed, yes, but it's a question also of how much closer will we get to the prospect of nuclear use. And you know, that it's never posed in those terms. It's always posed in terms of, yes, we need negotiations, just not now, by which they mean, you know, when Russia really is on the precipice of perhaps using nuclear weapons or escalating to unimaginable heights, what they're already doing. But also in terms of you know, what can we do? I'll return to the Turkey earthquake because I think it's an important example, because as horrific as events in Turkey already are, they actually could have been a hell of a lot worse, because in the quake zone, under construction as we speak, is the Akkuyu nuclear power plant. Now, Turkey has been after a nuclear power plant for some time. Work started on this site 2 decades ago. No, sorry, a decade ago. Work was suspended in 2018, but recommenced a couple of years afterwards. So there are currently no active nuclear reactors at this site in the quake zone, but 5 will be up and running in fairly short time, or when the work is complete, already before the earthquake, seawater, because like most nuclear power stations, it's stationed near the sea and being constructed near the sea, seawater was already seeping up into the construction. As a result of the earthquake, significant cracks have appeared in the infrastructure of the building. All of that's bad enough, but it could have been a hell of a lot worse had nuclear reactors been operating there at that point. Now, what can we do? Well, I think we should learn a lesson from what the people in the area are doing. They're looking at the Akkuyu nuclear power plant construction, and they are desperately alarmed, and they are protesting against it. They're trying to halt the construction of this site. They know what having such a plant as that would mean in the context of a quake zone. They know that if that quake had occurred with those 5 nuclear reactors in operation, we wouldn't be talking about 40,000 deaths plus, as horrific and unimaginable as that number is, but you'd be talking about hundreds of thousands, and you'd be talking about decades worth of nuclear and radioactive destruction and pollution in the area. So those people in the midst of a human disaster are on their feet and are trying to stop the prospect of something worse in the future. So in terms of what we can do, that's the sort of thing we can do. Once the alarm has been raised, once we know what the dangers are, you campaign, and you campaign openly. And I mentioned the expanding nuclear blueprint and the fact that US bombs are coming to Britain again. Well, one thing we can do is make sure as many of us as possible are outside of Lakenheath on the 20th of May for our 3rd demonstration to say, we don't want US NATO bombs. Thank you very much, back in the United Kingdom. That would be a disaster at the best of times, and it'd be absolutely reckless in the current situation.
Thanks, Tom. Ray, I'll come to you.
Oh, have I unmuted now?
Yep.
Am I right? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Just to say thank you, as always, to Tom for his very clear exposition, and to the other speakers for saying, what a desperate situation we're in. One thing I thought of, which we haven't recently made so much of, trying to show the general public, as they are always called, aren't they? As we've been saying, that they seem, Tom said, they're not aware of what war means somehow, even though it seems like it's fading into the past, and particularly about the use of nuclear weapons. And I think we ought to be raising more, Tom, if we can, however we can, the prospect of nuclear winter. I can remember some years ago when we had, in the height of the Cold War, we had 2 scientists touring Britain. Does anybody else remember that? Talking about the effects of nuclear winter and the horrors of it. And also at the same time, I think it was also in parallel, seeing that film Threads, which nobody talks about. Do you remember the film about what happened in Sheffield after a nuclear bomb? And perhaps we could raise that more in an effort to get more people to understand what a dire situation, and similarly a dire situation with nuclear reactors. Because while we're saying these wonderful people in that terrible situation are trying to raise the alarm about reactors in Turkey, what is happening in the UK? Both the government and the main opposition party believe we need, and they call it, nuclear reactors in the mix, as they call it, to get to zero and zero carbon emissions. And we don't. It's as simple as that. If you read everything that Ian Fairley says, and it's all on the CND website, we actually don't. In fact, just to point it up, there will be a conference on this in London on the 21st of April, I think, Tom. And I think we ought to be, that's another thing. There's so much for us all to do that we can't do it, can we? It's just impossible. Somebody said that to me. You can't at your age do all that, but I can do my bit. And I do write against nuclear reactors because it's not only crazy for us to be building them when we've got this threat of possible strikes, but in the grounds of climate change, which is so intersected with what we do. If we build that, which the Conservative government have given the go-ahead to Sizewell C on the east coast of England in a year or two, and we've been warned by climate scientists, it'd be underwater. It's absolutely crazy to be building nuclear reactors at this stage. And there are, as you know, many, many other arguments. You've all heard me talk about this. So, yeah, there are things we can do. And I think also, I understand Sue, and that lady who said she couldn't come on, you know, because I can't remember her name. Hazel, was it? Because it all seems so big, doesn't it? And overwhelming. But I can remember, having been the most aged among us, how I felt when I first learned about nuclear weapons, really back, 60 years. And I think that the way I got over that fear and not doing it is by actually doing something. And I still think that is true. However small the thing is, however it's only just a short letter or talking to your neighbour, whatever small thing, or joining in, actually doing something helps you get over the fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks. Tom, do you want to come back on that, or would you prefer it if Peter adds, and then you could answer both together? Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, just in the context of negotiations, Tom, I wondered what you thought about the Chinese proposals for talks, because our government has been systematic in trying to scupper any sort of discussions about negotiations. And it did seem to me just recently the Chinese have proposed a series of measures that they believe could form the basis of a negotiated settlement. And I just wondered how that resonated with you, what your thoughts were.
Thanks, Peter. I'll respond to Ray first. About 4 months ago, a guy called Chris Farley passed away. Now, none of you here have any reason to know who Chris Farley was, but he was on the first Aldermaston marches. If any of you were there, he was the guy playing his trumpet at the front. He was a very fine jazz musician, but he also ended up as Bertrand Russell's personal secretary. He died late last year, and I went to go and help clear some papers and books out of his house. And he ended up in Sheffield at a grand old age, and we parked the van up at some shops just across the road from where he lived. And I looked at these shops and I thought, this is the shop from Threads. I mean, I didn't see Threads originally. I was born in 1980, so I missed all of that, but I've seen it several times since, and it's moved me deeply. And kind of, it was a bit of a moment. There we were, going to clear some books and papers from this guy's house who'd spent decades doing peace and anti-nuclear campaigning. He started out working for Peace News, went to play his trumpet, ended up working for Bertrand Russell. And there he ended his days living opposite the shop from Threads. And I think, you know, it would take somebody like us, people like us, to kind of get that and to get the power of it. And this was at a moment where, you know, we already, you know, even before the clock was dialed to 90 seconds to midnight, we knew what the risks were and we knew what the dangers were. And I think it is a problem, actually, that, you know, that shop from Threads is not more widely, you know, or wouldn't have the same effect on people who go and shop in there daily. I think, you know, the realities of the risks we face and the dangers we face are, you know, are massively underappreciated. And I'll just, you know, I stood up to get this book off my shelf. You can't see my face, but can you see that picture? Who knows what this is?
Oh. Some coastline?
This is in the Marshall Islands, where the United Kingdom undertook its nuclear
That
test.
cement thing that covers all the waste.
Yeah, so that's the cement thing. So Britain let off all these bombs in these beautiful islands, shoveled as much radioactive and nuclear material as it could into one place, and put a big cement concrete cap on the top. Okay. Now the Marshall Islands are going to be completely swallowed by seawater very soon if climate change continues at the rate that it is continuing. Already seawater is lapping at the edges of this concrete cap. I mean, this relates to Ray's point about Sizewell C and the new reactor and rising sea levels. Who's doing anything about this? Because the islands are going to be submerged. That concrete cap over all this nuclear material is going to be submerged by seawater. What does seawater do to concrete? It erodes it, it eats it, destroys it, and that material is going to be released into the oceans. Who's doing anything about it? The Marshall Island people are obviously very disturbed and very unhappy, not just about the nuclear legacies and the pain and the suffering that has been imposed on them by Britain's nuclear project over the generations. Not only are they struggling for intergenerational justice to correct the wrongs that have been done against them, but they're now faced with, you know, man-made climate change, human-made climate change, not produced by them. The Marshall Islanders' carbon footprint is close to zero, I would suspect. But the same people who blew up their islands, buried all of this atomic and radioactive waste underneath it and put a concrete cap on top, the same people who were driving climate catastrophe, rising sea levels, and yet another nuclear disaster on these people. And there is no consistency of thinking, no humanity in these decisions, and the same crass stupidity, and I don't use that word lightly, stupidity, because I generally don't think people as individuals are stupid. It's just when they get together in the name of profit. But the same stupidity that it result in that horrific situation in the Marshall Islands is being delivered on the coast of Great Britain at Sizewell C. I mean, it's, you know, human decisions can only be corrected by better human decisions and collective human action, in my view. In terms of Peter's question about the Chinese negotiating points, I need to speak personally here rather than as presenting CND's view, because CND hasn't yet discussed it, although the International Advisory Group will discuss it tomorrow evening. I think the 12-point peace plan is incredibly important that the Chinese government has produced. I think it's worth looking at and it's worth reading. There are all sorts of reasons not to take what the Chinese government says in good faith. I recognise that, but I think with respect to their understanding of the international situation and the particular catastrophic issues that are presented by what is happening in Ukraine, I would take that proposal in good faith. And it's worth noting, you know, if you need any reason to take it in good faith, it's worth noting that Russia finds itself on the wrong side of each and every one of those 12 proposals. So any attempts to try and paint this up as a stop to Russia, I think is a mistaken view. It's actually China intervening, I think, quite credibly and in an important way to try and constructively intervene at the very least in what is happening in China. So I think it's worth looking at. If people haven't already, you should look at it. And I think, you know, we should have a generally positive reaction to it in terms of the specific situation in Ukraine. But let's be clear. I mean, CND is an organisation, and peace movements more generally are supportive of the idea of common security. I think I don't know how long ago it was, Ray, but you had played a role in discussions around common security when you were on the IAG.
Yes.
In the past.
Yes.
It's still a very important concept.
And the European one, OSCE. Yeah. I was promoting that at the time against, if you like, against NATO.
Yeah.
And still were many other people across Europe. I mean, it wasn't just us from the UK. It was started. So we have friends and allies on that from here to Finland. Yeah.
But the common security concept has been rebooted and was rebooted last year. But the common security, for those who aren't familiar with the subject, is with the concept, is the very simple idea that you can't guarantee your security at the expense of anybody else. Right, which seems like common sense to us who are interested in peace, but which seems quite alien to a number of other people. But it is a growing concept. It's something people understand, and it's actually something that the Chinese have repeatedly proposed. They don't use the term common security, but they have something called the Global Security Initiative. Which also taken at face value, suspend whatever other criticisms you might have of China. I think that's important in terms of international relations and international security and trying to prevent a nuclear war or World War III or whatever you want to call it. I think we have to take these things seriously. So I'll leave that at that for the moment.
Thank you, Tom. We could follow up and say, what do you think of the South African offer to be the negotiator, intermediator? But we won't go there. Nigel, have you got your hand up?
I have, yes.
Go ahead.
Could I ask Tom? He's got a great knowledge of European nuclear disarmament, and when you mentioned the new nuclear footprint, could you talk about the links? Something that might help fight all this is the links we have with those other nations in Europe who are going to get these American weapons. They are definitely going to get them. We probably will get them at Lakenheath. So I wondered if you could tell us about any links between CND and the European nations who are also going to get these American weapons.
Shall I do that? Because that's a good news story. I mean, we are not alone. I mean, it is a difficult situation for the peace movement generally across, the West. But in terms of an understanding of the threats that US nuclear weapons based in Europe, as far as that is concerned, there is, widespread alarm, and there are widespread efforts to get rid of them. So, it is the 60th anniversary this year of nuclear weapons first being stationed in Belgium, for instance. 60 years ago, this coming October, there was an enormous demonstration against it. 40 years ago this October, there was I think one of the biggest demonstrations in Belgium outside of a general strike took place in opposition to US Pershing missiles being stationed in Belgium. And the Belgian peace movement will be at the Kleine Bruegel base in Belgium, which has a Belgium name, but which is a US base, and where there are US nuclear bombs. So they are quite consistently and with much effort building for that massive demonstration. But there are ongoing activities in Belgium each and every month of the year, highlighting the presence of US nuclear weapons and opposing them. And remember also, Belgium is the home of the NATO headquarters. So CND has very close links with these people, and we work with them through something called the Nuclear Free Europe Network, also the NATO War Network, the IPB, the International Peace Bureau, and others. In the Netherlands coming up, ranging from the sort of peace movement you have in Belgium, which is very much led by the left, in inverted commas, to what's happening in the Netherlands. It does have a secular peace movement, but in August this year, Pax Christi and the Catholic Worker Movement will be staging civil disobedience and a peace camp outside of the Kleine Bruegel base, which is also one of the places where the new B-6112s will be stationed. An active, militant in their own terms, peace movement. In Germany, around the Buchel Air Base, which is where the old B-61s were based, which is undergoing huge construction work at the moment, but which is where the new B-6112, these steerable, dialable, in inverted commas, usable new nuclear bombs, there are ongoing and very active, big activities around that, ranging from things organised by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Christian peace movement, through to the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War German branch, through to the secular mass peace movement in Germany, and CND is working with them. Italy is a very important and very courageous example of the work that's being done, because for decades around the two bases in northern Italy, where US nuclear bombs are stationed, there are consistent efforts to oppose them, and there are mass efforts to oppose them. But these efforts are very much linked with, if ever you think that you are in a minority view in terms of the situation that we face, just remember that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Italy from north to south and across over last weekend, calling for peace in Ukraine and calling for negotiations and calling for NATO to get the hell out of Italy itself. And they have a very expensive, very active movement. So to conclude all of this, on the 20th of May, when we're back at Lakenheath, we will have a representative from the Netherlands peace movement, a guy called Guido, who has organised demonstrations and a cycling demonstration actually around the US nuclear base there. We'll have Rainer Braun from Germany, who's been involved in the Buchel demonstrations, and hopefully we'll have somebody from Italy coming across and Europeanising our demonstration at Lakenheath. But that's an important point that Nigel makes. I could say more about what has happened in Germany, and perhaps if you want to invite me back to talk about the German situation, I could talk at length about that. But you'll all have seen my surname, so I know a bit about it, but I won't expand on that at the moment.
Thanks. Have we got any other hands raised? Carol.
Yes, thanks very much. Thank you, Tom, for your exposition of the sort of threats that we're facing from climate change and from nuclear war. We tried to give out some leaflets on Saturday outside the railway station because some of us couldn't manage to get up to London. And the total sort of blank faces that passed us by when we were trying to give out these leaflets made me realise that what we've been facing in this country is an absolute complete narrative that the government and the opposition party has put through the media to completely blind people to what's really happening. You don't get the other side at all. They've completely brainwashed us, I think, into thinking that we can do nothing about these things. So it's really good to hear about these massive demonstrations that are taking place in other European countries against having NATO weapons on their soil, nuclear weapons, and also against the war, again, for a peace deal in Ukraine. It's really good to hear that. And I think we need to hear more of that, because at the moment there's a complete blank in our media about anything like that. It's as though every single person in this country, apart from those here present tonight, of course, and other people up and down the country who think the same way as we do, that it's a done deal, you know, that we supply Ukraine with all the weapons it needs until it wins against Russia. And that's the narrative. And it's been across our media now for 12 months. And it's really hard to get through that blanket coverage. And I'd just like to ask whether or not there's any other way that we can reach people, basically.
Shall I come back on that? I mean,
sorry, Tom, maybe I can add a little bit to that also, because I've also got something you may be able to help me with. When you were a toddler in the 80s, we were demonstrating against crews in particular, and I think probably one of the reasons why we kind of succeeded and actually managed to boot crews out at that point is that the population at large somehow, in a strange love-like way, did believe in mutually assured destruction and never, absolutely unthinkable weapons as a way to protect the world. But along comes this newcomer, which was described as battlefield nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, and then, of course, the real killer phrase was first use. And of course, the militarists were actually using these terms. And I think that made our lives just a little bit easier, because those people who've been brought up in the Strangelove way of thinking did see that this was a game changer. And therefore, I think we managed to succeed. But now along comes these new terms. It's not the first use being used, but it's the use, the dialable idea. And somehow we're not able to kind of make people realize, that this is a game changer. Your comments?
I'll come back on Carol first, and I know lack of critical voices. And again, I'll take my CND hat off and make a personal comment here, because it is very difficult. And on the anniversary of the invasion, lots of people had the chance to hear what President Zelensky said, and that's entirely understandable. But as I was cooking dinner for my children around 5 o'clock, the Radio 4 was on, and there was a translation of an interview with Zelensky, which was aired without comment. And he was asked, who has disappointed you most in the last 12 months? Who has disappointed you most? The answer, all those who have fled the country. And previously he'd said, he was willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. I mean, if you put those two together, and then imagine for yourself that there was no critical commentary on the news or anywhere really about that fact, then I find that quite difficult to sort of square. I mean, my father-in-law lives in Cornwall. He's got a nice big house. He's got a Ukrainian family of refugees living with them. They're lovely people. But the idea that these people have somehow disappointed Zelensky by not wanting to be in a war zone or not joining the fight, I find quite, I was just disturbed by it. And so this is a personal comment about kind of where we're at in terms of the dialogue and the narrative on the situation. And it is quite difficult to be critical, Carol. I mean, you know, and it's particularly difficult when you don't hold concerns about the prospect of nuclear war somewhere close to the front of your mind. I think, you know, there are a lot of people who imagine that this is simply a good versus evil battle, that as many weapons as possible need to be given to the Ukrainians, that there will be no other consequences, that it's simply that, and that the existential risk isn't there. And I think, you know, that existential risk has been removed from the narrative. You know, in the same way that the idea that millions of Ukrainians should die has been removed, you know, in the way that Zelensky did. I mean, that's my personal view, not Cindy's view. I'm saying it personally. The way that has been, you know, any critical comments about that proposal or that idea have not been aired. But also the fact that the existential risk has been removed from the narrative, I find deeply, deeply troubling. And I think the more of us who are speaking out on that, the better. I have little hope, to be quite frank, that establishment politicians, whether or not they call themselves lefties or not, are going to do much about it. And I think it's up to us, quite frankly, and those of us assembled here and in meetings like this up and down the country, who have good sense, who are the hope. In terms of looking back at the 1980s, I was at a meeting in, I went to the first meeting of state parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Vienna last year. That was an incredibly important meeting, but I won't say much more about the TPNW at the moment, but I went to a number of other meetings around that. And one thing that struck me, we had a more general discussion about what's different between now and the 1980s. What's gone on? And this sort of relates to Carol's point as well. And Austrian guy, Volta, said, well, we were terrified in the 1980s. We were terrified. He said, I'm still terrified now. But the fact of the matter is that not many people are terrified. And something has happened, because in many respects, we know that the situation now is actually more dangerous, really, than it was in the 80s. In the 80s, Reagan and Gorbachev were talking to one another. They were meeting at summits. They were agreeing to treaties. There was a hotline. They could pick up the phone and talk to one another. That's not the case now. That's not the case now. But I suppose you have to think through what the implications of being terrified are. I mean, is it the case that we've had too much of it and that we're now immune? I mean, something has gone on. Something has gone on. And, the use of language is also very interesting as well, because, during the 80s, I imagine in large parts of the population, people knew what cruise, everybody understood what you meant. Pershings, people know what that meant. SS-20s, everybody knew what that meant. When I start going on about B-6112s, who on earth knows what that means, apart from people who apart from Nigel and me and the rest of us now. I mean, it's a different language. And you think about even the names for the weapon. I mean, I have thought about this before, but so at the moment in Europe now, the launch is already deployed for these things, and the whole systems are on their way. They're being based in Germany at some point, but there's a hypersonic weapon system, a US hypersonic weapon system being stationed there. So these are hypersonic missiles. They go many, 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 many times the speed of sound. They are first strike weapons, which means that they would be, and they would almost certainly they're targeted at, or will be targeted at, the Russian command and control systems, which are all fairly highly concentrated around Moscow. They're bunker busting sort of weapons, not nuclear, right? So this whole system of weapons has been given the name Dark Eagle, right? Dark Eagle rolls off the tongue. It's, creates an image. It's meant to be scary, meant to be, meant to mean something. So this weapon system is called Dark Eagle, but the far more destructive and far more deadly and dangerous joint system, because that's what the aeroplane and the bombs are, don't have one catchy phrase to describe them, but they're the F-35Es and the B-6112s. Why is it that the nuclear things have these long-winded acronyms, that can't get a purchase in the imagination, but these new super high-tech conventional weapons are Dark Eagle? It's, and you'll remember when Trump dropped the largest conventional bomb on the Tora Bora Mountains in Afghanistan. Nigel or somebody else, what was that bomb called? It had some stupid, awful,
I'm trying to think of it.
but you know what I mean? It was given some sort of comic book name, this conventional bomb. Yeah. I mean, probably, close to as powerful as the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. Maybe not as powerful, but something in that order. It had some comic book ridiculous name. But no, you don't. These names aren't given to these weapons of existential threat. So even in the whole dialogue around these weapons, it's quite cleverly done in terms of how people are able to talk about them and how people are able to kind of unfold and understand their implications and their meaning. And I think that is an issue, actually, and I find the whole language of tactical nuclear weapons quite difficult, because everybody's meant to believe that somehow these are a lesser thing, but actually every single piece of modeling, whether it's from the Rand Corporation in the United States to anywhere else, once there's one detonation of a nuclear weapon, no matter how large, no matter what the circumstances, whether it's on a populated area or a so-called demonstration detonation, all of the modeling of what then takes place leads to all-out nuclear war, right? So there will not be a tactical weapon nuclear war. It will rapidly escalate, according to all of the modeling, to all-out nuclear confrontation. Which makes the use of language, and which makes kind of determining the parameters of what we're facing all the more difficult. How do you communicate it? I mean, I'd like to know if people have ideas, because it's a difficult one.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks. We always try to be fair to our speakers and let them escape at 9 o'clock. So we've reached that witching hour. Sorry about that, Ray, but it's probably dangerous if we just keep going forever. By the way, you've seen...
Yes, I'm very dangerous. I hope I'm dangerous.
Deadly.
Yeah, keep up being dangerous. I hope you've seen in the meeting chat that Father Claro, he had to leave early, but he thanked us very much for this. And then Peter has sent a link to a very good webinar. It's safest if you just click on it now and store it yourself, because sometimes when you look at the recording afterwards, then the chat isn't actually saved. It's one of these funny glitches of Zoom recordings. But anyway, Tom, for me, it's certainly been an unbelievably thoughtful but also very knowledgeable presentation from you. So thank you very much for that. I have to be honest, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to convince Hazel to come because of this presentation.
I'm sorry.
but nonetheless, you've made some very important points. One that I'm going to remember is, yeah, it's up to us that it's the problems are being created by humans and the solutions have to come from humans, i.e. us. Anyway, a huge thank you, and if we could all ask to thank Tom in the usual way. Thanks. Oh, here we go.
Invite me back for a more cheerful topic.
Well, I'm sure that Jenny has been scribbling down the various topics that she's going to ask you to speak on in future meetings. Anyway, thanks everyone, and I'll by all means leave, and then I'll end the meeting for all. The recording will be available on the website.
Bye.
Thanks again. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.